Thank you. The title of this panel is New Perspectives in Trauma and Resilience Research. And we have a nice program, I think, with different speakers. The first one is Michael Pettit. He's a professor of historical, theoretical, and critical studies of psychology at York University, Toronto, Canada. And he's author of several books and articles on the history of psychology. The most recent one is Governed by Effect, Hot Cognition and the End of Cold War Psychology, and it will be published by Oxford University Press, I think, next month or something like that. Yeah. So now you have a little ad for that. It looks very interesting, though. And Michael will be talking about, his title of the presentation is What Counts as Resilience? A Genealogy of the Invulnerable Child. Thank you.
All right, so yes, today I'm going to be talking about resilience. This talk actually came out of a previous conference with the cultmind group where I went on a mild rant about resilience, and I explained why I hated the term so much. And I guess today's talk is the more fulsome explanation of why I can't stand the word resilience. Okay. In the days, weeks, and years following September 11th, 2001, the term for psychological resilience was suddenly everywhere. And when I say September 11th, I mean this quite literally. On September 16th, 2001, US President George W. Bush, on the eve of the reopening of the stock market following the terrorist attacks, declared his great faith in the resiliency of the US economy. And at the same time this was happening, social psychologists all on different university campuses, social psychologists were also studying resiliency. And this term had recently become available to, so resiliency has kind of this dual history, and 9/11 is kind of this pivot point. Up until then, resilience had largely been a language of child development, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, where it came out of. And earlier in 2001, Ann Maston, a child development psychologist at the University of Minnesota, which will become relevant soon, as part of a new special issue of The American Psychologist, dedicated to the new emerging field of positive psychology, wrote a review article on resilience as ordinary magic, right? This capacity for at-risk children to bounce back in the face of adversity. And I want to suggest there's kind of this isomorphism between the individual and the state in these days. Just as George W. Bush wanted the economy to bounce back without any sign of trauma from the event, we're going to go back to flying, we're going to go back to shopping, whilst we export all the violence internationally, right? We're commentarily, whilst we're making the world crap, so too is the figure of the psychologist. So for example, Barbara Fredrickson literally starts her work on resilience on September 20th, 2001. That's a lot of initiative. Within a week to start up a whole psychological study with your research pool. What that says about these psychologists, I'm not supposed to say these things. Okay, so within 10 years, there's kind of two views of resilience. Two views. So this is from spring 2011. One is a Time news story, an interview with Scott Lilienfeld, who was a clinical psychologist who was highly critical of a lot of pop psychology. And in the wake of the Fukushima disaster in Japan, he's interviewed by Time magazine, and he says, what should psychology do? Get out of the way. Ordinary people have the capacity, the cultural strengths to bounce back. Intervening early, doing these debriefings, is only going to instill the trauma. Psych culture, get out of the way. A different version of resilience, Martin Seligman, also from 2011, in the Harvard Business Review. Let me tell you about my resilience program. By giving young children, 8 or 9 years old, a preventative vaccine in CBT, we can immunize them from life's traumas. So here's the two views of resilience. Is resilience a critique of therapeutic culture, or its intensification? And I want to suggest that resilience flourished, to use a positive psychology term, in that ambiguity that I'm going to try to map out today. So if you look at these kind of literature reviews of resilience that are coming out in the late 90s, early 2000s, what's being taken up by Lilienfeld, what's being taken up by Seligman, they point to kind of three founding figures. Emily Werner, who is a Northern California psychologist at the University of California at Davis. She joined what was an already existing cohort study of children born in Hawaii in the wake of statehood, and looking at how impoverished children managed to succeed despite the odds. The next central figure here is Michael Rudder. So we've heard a lot of the Tavistock. This is the enemy, right? This is the Institute of Psychiatry across town who, the baddies. And the other one is Norman Garmese, who comes from the University of Minnesota, which is essentially the American equivalent of the Institute of Psychiatry. This is Midwestern Dust Bowl empiricism. Okay? And each of these figures is involved in a large population-based study as opposed to a clinical study. The Chinokwai was a complete census of the children born in I think 1947. Michael Rudder is interested in educational attainment and ability in two island populations, as he describes it. One on the pastoral Isle of Wight, looking back to a harmonious rural English past. One is inner city immigrant London, largely with the windfall generation and how the issues that are going on there. Norman Garmese is working initially with the children of schizophrenics and their kind of invulnerability to, whether they're vulnerably invulnerable to that, and then later with impoverished children. And within this tradition, I argue there's kind of three, I can't prove this today, I have much longer, but I can talk about it, but kind of three prerequisites or ways of thinking pre-configure resilience and make it thinkable. The first one is Bowlbyism, right? This idea that comes out of World War II that sees childhood as an especially time of great vulnerability to trauma, right? And that early deprivation will necessarily lead to lifelong psychic damage. And it's, so there's John Bowlby, the person, and Bowlbyism, the ideology. Bowlbyism is how this cluster of ideas really gets taken up as a critique of total institutions in the 1950s and 1960s, and is mobilized in complicated ways, I'll try to show, in welfare state policies. So that's one prerequisite. This Bowlbyism, that childhood is a period of great vulnerability, and deprivation has necessary lifelong psychic consequences. The second prerequisite I want to point to is the rise of psychiatric epidemiology. Here I would think of someone like Hans Eysenck and his very famous studies of the effectiveness of psychotherapy, right? That basically the people on the wait list will do as well as the people that are being treated, right? Rudder is very much a student of Eysenck, so instead of meeting the people in the clinic, we are going to use population-based studies to find dispositions. And here it is the rise of the actuarial risk factor as the real thing. The real thing is the risk factor, right? That if you have this clusters of risk factors, this should happen to you. And the final thing I want to highlight as a prerequisite is the coloniality of being of an Anglophone field's fascination with often literal island communities for natural experience amongst the poor. So in my field of psychology, we talk a lot about weird research these days, right? The weirdness of psychology. It's based on, USian white undergraduates. This research was not. That does not mean it's more inclusive, that it's better research. It is we also these days talk a lot about extractive research in psychology. This research that I'm going to talk about today is definitionally extractive, right? You go, you take, you generalize, and that will come up again. So given these common factors for this kind of common factor approach to psychology, there's an odd person missing in the literature reviews for resilience. And this is Jerome Kagan. Jerome Kagan, I'm not rescuing an obscure figure from the margins. Jerome Kagan is a profoundly influential American developmental psychologist. He was a Harvard professor for about 50 years. He served on the Nixon administration's Science Advisory Committee for Educational Research. He's incredibly influential. So given his ubiquity in developmental psychology, and in that, by understanding he's talking about resilience, why is he not there? So I'm going to talk today a little bit about a study that Kagan conducted in rural Guatemala in 1972 on a series of rural Mayan villages, and his conclusion that early deprivation does not determine later development, that biological maturation and culture matter more than individual intervention. So, a bit of context here. I talked a few minutes ago about Bowlbyism and the welfare state as being kind of one of the key contexts here, and this is very much Kagan's. Before Kagan goes to Guatemala, he is deeply involved in a pressing debate of the late 1960s. Should the US state fund universal daycare? Right? And we've made great progress on this issue. This is not something we still talk about, but at the time, there is a bill as part of the Johnson administration's Great Society and these kind of social democrats to pass a federal bill to fund universal daycare. And Kagan, as one of Nixon's advisors, opposes this bill, right? Because he sees daycare as potentially dangerous. Steeped in Bowlbyism, right? If we have universal daycare, we are going to create Soviet-style total institutions for these sensitive young children that are going to destroy their psyches. Kagan is an empiricist. He's doing research. He himself decides to so nationally he opposes it. It's also very much a local story for Kagan. In Boston, he sets up an experimental daycare in the Roxbury neighborhood to sort of test out these kind of Bowlbyism theses. This is met with almost immediate repute from the local Black Power organization on which he wants to conduct the research. He wants to conduct the research on the position that no matter what Kagan finds is going to be damaging to the community. If he finds the daycare cannot help the children, that's going to be bad policy-wise. If a bunch of white psychologists come in and improve the children, that's going to be damaging. They chase them out of town. And he actually moves across town, sets up a daycare in Boston's Chinatown, and then flees to Guatemala for his sabbatical to get away from the local politics. And this is what he finds. So working with a local nutrition institute, the Institute for Nutrition in Central America and Panama, he conducts these kind of psychological tests on it's a cross-sectional design, not a longitudinal design, sort of comparing the cognitive abilities of newborns and aging children. And what he finds is in these rural villages, the newborns live fairly secluded, isolated lives. And on the early cognitive tests, they are highly deprived, right? They score incredibly poorly. He said, and yet the 11-year-olds seem to flourish and seem to compare very well to its middle-class white American cohorts. A few notes about Kagan and Guatemala. For Kagan, Guatemala represents a pre-Columbian state of nature. He is not talking about a Guatemala mired in a civil war and a genocidal campaign against the indigenous populations. That doesn't really come up. I'm not sure why. Well, I need to do more research. But the key thing here is these are the findings Kagan takes back to the United States. So this is the New York Times version. This is the American Psychologist version. But essentially, in both cases, very publicly, so the New York Times is a report from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where Kagan gives the findings. Margaret Mead says, congratulations, you're doing anthropological work, we're very happy. But essentially, early deprivation is not a life sentence, that children can mature and bounce back. So this is how Kagan talks about the studies over the next couple of years. So these are some snippets from different interviews in various magazines. For Kagan, his work on resilience points to the dangers of psychological classification and the early resulting pathologization of early life. So we've got to stop the very early and I think premature rank ordering of children in grades 1, 2, and 3. We decide too soon. A few years later, in the Canadian women's magazine Chatelaine, parenting need not be the intense, overwhelming, onerous duty it is often assumed to be. This will lift a load of guilt from the shoulders of parents who fear their kids' lives may be blighted by divorce, loss of a parent, long hours in daycare, or inadequate affection. So essentially, Bowlbyism has made us pathologize early childhood too much. Late bloomers can happen. Let the kids be. Let's ease off the gas pedal. But Kagan's work is almost on resilience is almost immediately drawn into these debates about early intervention, Project Head Start, and the Great War's World on Poverty, right? So as I said, when I talk about daycare, should we intervene in early childhood? So here are two of Kagan's fellow developmentalists and why they did not like the Guatemala study and how it was taken up over the next couple of years. You could see the impact this would have on many people, including people in policy-making kinds of positions. So while Dr. Kagan had no such intention of issuing this as a definitive paper for policy decisions, by the premature release, he exacerbated the situation. What situation? Here's William Kesson, another fellow development psychologist. It is convenient and cheap and fits with the administration to take no action, right? That essentially is saying, by letting the kids be, to grow on their own, we don't need to fund these expensive, complicated early intervention programs. So this takes me to the final thing. And I think this is partly why Kagan does not fit into how psychologists told the history of resilience. Essentially, he left no space for psychological expertise, right? He's sort of saying, we need to get out of the way, that kind of Lindqvist position. So throughout resilience's history, there's a fight, and that fight is that Lindqvist versus Sigmund dichotomy I presented. Is resilience a trait, a property of people and communities that they have? Or is it a process, a cognitive skill that we as experts can teach? And what I want to suggest is that resilience as a concept represents both a critique of therapeutic culture and, ironically, its intensification. And it's in fact this ambiguity that contributes to the concept's appeal amongst heterogeneous audiences. So that's one thing I want to say. The next thing I want to say is that resilience marks a shift in our understanding of psychological damage away from a discrete, acute, and extraordinary trauma in a person's confined to a person's past to the accumulation and accretion of adversity in the body. So we can think of the rise of adverse childhood experiences as opposed to discrete traumatic events. And I think resilience is not the cause, but is a powerful index of what the psychological and the therapeutic means today. It does represent the psychologization of the everyday, but in a very minimalistic and threadbare and yet universalizing and omnipresent manner. And it is precisely this kind of minimalist yet everywhere psychologization that I think resilience represents And that's kind of how it squares that kind of critique, yet intensification of therapeutic culture. Thank you.
Thank you for a very well-timed talk. Our next speaker is Kate Sheese. She's a lecturer and research associate at the Sigmund Freud University in Berlin, Germany. Her research explores issues related to gender, displacement, and solidarity in crisis and conflict. As a practitioner, Kate works with organizations in crisis setting to develop contextualized, responsive staff care structures. The title of Kate's presentation is Holding It Together, Exploring Notions of Stress, Suffering and Recovery Among Activists at the Humanitarian Border. Please welcome Kate.
How's this? Is this audible? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about activist volunteers at the Humanitarian Border in Greece in 2015 and 16 at the height of the so-called refugee crisis. And I'm going to talk specifically about their struggles to feel and to comprehend. I'm interested in the ways in which the pain of registering violence appears as fundamentally difficult to apprehend, at least in some of these narratives of some of these volunteers and activists. So it wasn't the only emotion or sort of phenomenon that came up, but it's one that I'm particularly interested in and will focus on today. So I'm struck by participants' attempts to register, to apprehend, and to do the work they felt they needed to do of processing towards imagined recovery, and the profound incomprehension when expected emotions did not present themselves for processing, or perhaps at all. Their struggles to register, apprehend, and comprehend suggest to me that they're available frames for making sense, frames like burnout in particular, but also vicarious trauma, discourses of self-care, could not really bear the weight of the pain of registering violence. And I want to note, that these concepts do really important work in making suffering socially and bureaucratically legible, and they enable claims to recognition, acknowledgement, and care. So I don't want to throw them out the window. But the nature of the suffering in the midst of violence and in the midst of destruction, the particularly elusive and ambiguous ways it is experienced, did not seem to quite register within these conceptual frames. And the social, affective, political conditions that gave rise to this particular kind of suffering are not easily accounted for by these frames. I want to focus specifically on a few aspects of what activists told me about, or what I pulled out from their narrative. So one is irreconcilable affects. I want to talk about ethical and psychic insufficiency, and then loss of self, composure, and a kind of senselessness. And I'm drawing here on ethnographic work that I did with international independent activist volunteers in refugee camps in Greece. That's a mouthful. What that means, these are people from all around the world. I was one of these people, I should note, who traveled to Greece in 2015 or 2016, and who were largely unaffiliated with established or formal organizations on the ground there. So NGOs, etc., or civil society organizations. And they traveled from different countries around the world to intervene in this crisis. So most of the people that I interviewed worked in Idomeni camp, which was a makeshift camp in the north of Greece at the border with Macedonia, and surrounding makeshift camps. Participants came, and you can see here a little bit. Oh no, yes. You can see a bit about them here. They came from different countries. They had different migration and settler histories themselves, different ethnic, racial backgrounds, varying professional experiences, and differing levels of political engagement prior to sort of enacting this political engagement. Most of them saw their decision to engage in Greece as a political decision, and they saw their work as a form of resistance. But not all. Some of them described their work and their decision to do this work as an extension of previous professional experience in aid work or in human rights. And a few considered this work to be their first experience taking real action in the face of injustice. So activist volunteers in Greece intervened in a complex and contradictory machinery of migration management, and that includes both the policies and the practices that make up the European border regime and the humanitarian aid industry. And so they were sort of straddling, I'm not sure that's actually the best image, but sort of in between straddling these different sort of logics and machineries. And in this time, as EU migration policy became increasingly restrictive, characterized by policies of deterrence, containment, and externalization, migration management practices likewise became increasingly coercive. A key feature of this crisis-led border regime was the establishment and emergence of transit spaces, places like informal spaces like railway stations, makeshift camps, in gas stations. You'll hear about one of these, as well as more institutionalized spaces like reception centers, and in hotspots that you may have heard about in Italy and in Greece. So these spaces bring together a wide and diverse range of actors, including, in this case, activist volunteers, whose aims and functions and practices frequently blur together and reproduce tensions between protection, surveillance, compassion, repression, humanity, and security. And these tensions produced pronounced uncertainty and intense distress, and saturated activist volunteers' narratives in their interviews. Rosaku describes how the abundance of highly fragmented actors in Greece at this time produced a disorienting migration maze. And in my work, I've elaborated how this maze was not only structurally disorienting, but morally, ethically, and emotionally disconcerting. It constituted a devastating context where the structurelessness and fragmented nature of volunteers organizing compounded the fracturing and shattering experiences of confronting multiple ongoing limit situations. Participants described to me a sudden immersion into a scene that was tremendously difficult to apprehend and to make sense of. Their narratives really underscore the absurd. They often used ridiculousness as a metric for trustworthiness. Who's ridiculous and not to be trusted. And they pointed often to the deeply felt incongruities between what appeared as a festival and frenzied choreography around dramatic suffering and death. In this passage, I can't see. There it is. In this passage, an activist, Amanda, she's volunteering in a makeshift camp at a gas station, which is called Eco gas station. You'll see that in this passage, and she's trying to reconcile the beauty and the livingness and the getting by that she sees in the camp every day with the violence of being stranded and detained indefinitely in tents at a gas station. And you can see this as a deep ethical dilemma that she's experiencing. She talks about this group of people who are living in Eco gas station who had put up a volleyball net and they're playing a game of volleyball. There's a tent that had music coming out of it. It was early evening, the calmest time at Eco. The light is soft, the people are starting to cook. There's this livingness, there's a getting by, there's a togetherness. And then she concludes with this, yeah, but it's a gas station and they're trapped here. Another participant, Zoe, narrated a similar sort of irreconcilability of ordinary and extraordinary affects. She said, all the grief I've been bottling up for the past 2 months in Idomeni, and I've just been suppressing and being like, no, everything's good. What we're doing is fine. I've got this. But like recognizing, like, I hope it's okay to say what she said exactly, but recognizing that like the shit I've been through is fucking traumatic. It's traumatic. Like, it's bizarre to me that I go off to work in the morning and I'm like, oh, forgot to pack my contact lens and saline fluid for the tear gas. Like, that's crazy. That's crazy. And just all the fucking desperation and human tragedy that we see every day, that you just, nah, that's just normal now. So this ordinary scene that she depicts, and the language of going off to work and her tone, is punctuated by the anticipation and memories of riots and police military violence. Mundane objects become contingencies for violent repression. Both of these passages evoke a painful irreconcilability and hint at the production of impossible situations characterized by psychic and ethical insufficiency. Amanda's narrative, which you saw here, asks what kind of person thinks this place is nice on any level, or experiences pleasure here, or hopes it won't be shut down. Together, Amanda and Zoe's narrative summon unspecified but threatening doubts about the legitimacy and meaningfulness of activists' interests and interventions, and Zoe conjures the not yet signifiable loss in brutal violence and repression becoming a part of everyday experience. Notably, one that she can leave. She can decide to leave. So engaging in this context produced powerful and ambivalent fears around lack of limits and boundaries, and engendered a split between feelings of an omnipotence and futility. Activists described being unable to set boundaries or limits to their work, believing, paradoxically, that they had achieved absolutely nothing, and simultaneously that stopping would be catastrophic. In many ways, their narratives imply that in this context, breakdown or psychic death was the only morally acceptable exit. Working in the ambiguous spaces between different, often conflicting frames of moral, ethical, and political praxis, without personal or institutional limits, and within a weak relational frame, gave people the terrifying feeling that they were, quote, working in the dark, unable to grasp the meaning of anything, unable to recognize the meaning, the value, or the ethics of their work. And sensing the lack of traceable limits and boundaries in self, time, and relations, and tasks, provoked profound anxieties related to intrusion, spilling, and disintegration. Oops. One interview participant that you can see here, Rabia, described endless scenes of urgent despair, and the details of her narrative collide, and its chronology collapses. So she's talking about when she started out working in Hungary. In Hungary, we couldn't give them. Can you believe that you're in one of the most beautiful capital cities in Europe and have people coming that you can't give them food? Everything is shut down. All the restaurants around Kaleti station say, no, we're not going to give you the food. And she goes on, and more voices come up. She talks about the people begging, please, please, with the accent, with the language, please, please give me a piece of bread, I'm hungry. The other one, she miscarried in front of me, and I can't take her to the hospital. And she goes on and on, talking about how these voices, it's just killing me. As an Arabic speaker who was fluent in both Hungarian and English, Rabia was able to apprehend what everyone around her was saying. People on the move, smugglers, the police, the shopkeepers. She was at all times hyper-aware of the vast range of needs, demands, risks, and potential complications. She attempted to deal with all of it. Language brought her into contact and into relationship and made her vulnerable to intrusion. All these voices reverberating in her mind, not being able to quiet them, killing her. Participants frequently described feelings of being beyond oneself, an expansive scope of experience, a hyper-focus, a sense of being in the present, as well as the loss, sometimes numbing, sometimes thrilling, sometimes both, the loss of oneself. One participant, Hannah, spoke about being so confused, also, being so consumed by doing that months seemed to go by without thinking or feeling. She described a wide range of horrible events: multiple shipwrecks, attending to wounds without sufficient training, breaking up knife fights, and emphasized several times that despite all of this, she's not had any reactions. And she's been consistently calm and very unemotional. And she noted that actually before this, she was a highly emotional person. And so this sort of provoked a bit of confusion in her. And tracing sort of her narratives about her own non-reactions, you trace the contours of a rather profound struggle to make sense. And she describes the first time she took a break from the work and went home to Oslo to stay with her parents for a week. She expected to be flooded with the negative emotions that she believed she had not yet had the time to feel, but they did not appear. She expected to spend the whole time thinking about Greece, but found herself instead thinking about nothing at all, even trying to, quote, to think about what I am thinking, but grasping nothing. Strikingly, a certain self-awareness appeared momentarily when she saw herself in a documentary. She said, I saw myself carrying people out of boats, and we realized, like, this is actually what I'm doing every day. When I saw that, that was really weird. And then I was like, oh, God. And I had to go to my room, and it's like, is this what I've been doing for months? It looked more real when I saw it like that, because when I felt it, I felt like it was more in a dream, or not in a dream. So, oh, great. Extraordinary affects are not only difficult and painful to reconcile with ordinary affects, their irreconcilability does something to the, quote, quality of a continual motion of relations, scenes, contingencies, and emergences. This is Stewart. Such that people may no longer feel caught up in something that feels like something, or perhaps, this is my thought, or perhaps no longer feeling caught in anything that feels like anything, or everything that feels like nothing, like in a dream, not a dream. Thank you. Many activists described incomprehension at this apparent lack of feeling in the face of a wide range of horrors. And they understood this lack ambivalently, both as a sign of being especially resilient and as a threat of looming breakdown. And those were both there at the same time. So confronting multiple ongoing limit situations, being in the midst of destruction and registering violence, activists struggled to symbolize their experiences and to comprehend their inability to make sense. And I think that making sense of these frightening experiences requires a more spacious, dynamic, relational, and importantly, embodied theoretical framework than the available discourses of burnout and self-care. Also cognitive models of emotional processing, and certainly resolution and mastery. Their experiences suggest that there might be, in fact, something worth protecting in the experience of not being able to immediately grasp and encapsulate that which evades symbolization. Burke writes, there is a danger in understanding too much about trauma. That is to say, believing prematurely and absolutely in the achievement of psychic and narrative resolution. The danger in the case of activists registering ongoing violence of the humanitarian border is the way in which this absolute or premature belief in resolution pushes them towards an encapsulating rigidity, severely undermining the ability to be moved, to be affected, to be responsible. And this is a kind of sort of clever trick of language, right? So responsible in the sense of doing the right thing and ethics, but also response-able, so able to give a response. So responsibility is a notion fundamentally bound up with disturbance, contamination, and destruction, and all the grief and sorrow these conditions entail. It's a relational capacity to cultivate and sustain conditions for ongoingness, not resolution and mastery, but ongoingness in the face of and in the midst of devastating urgencies. And finally, protecting responsibility in traumatizing contexts requires a, quote, relational home, a context in which devastating affects can be shared and held, not resolved, but made more bearable, a relational home, what Valerie Walkerdine calls an effective skin, offers the sense of a protective boundary shielding people from terrifying feelings of and fears of spilling into boundless space that I heard so much about. And in the context of the ongoing violence and devastation, it's important to say that the making more bearable is not in the service of cultivating resilience, so as to be able to accumulate and endure more violence. In this context, the effective containment offers the release from the individual burden, and I would say the illusion or delusion of holding it all together, right? Both in the sense of I'm holding it all together in my mind and my psyche, but I'm also holding this whole context together. I can't stop. It would be devastating because I'm holding it all together. And I think that relational containment allows for the loosening of one's grip. And you can let loose in the sense of crying or raging, or let loose and allow oneself to be moved, knowing that we are holding it all together. So, thank you.
Thank you. Our next we have two speakers from Sweden. Mona Lindqvist is a clinical psychologist who has worked as a psychologist with refugee children. She's based at the Transcultural Center in region Stockholm. Mona Serenius is a former board member of the Society of Finnish War Children in Sweden and also worked as a psychoanalyst. And their talk is about the Finnish war children in Sweden, and it's very interesting. I should note that there were also Finnish war children in Denmark, actually about 4,000, I think, and I think 10% or something like that was later adopted by Danish families, but we haven't done any, or not very much research on that, and not about the experiences of these children. So I'm looking much forward to hear what you will sell. Thank you.
Ska vi säga det? Okej. I'm Mona Serenius because we both have the same name and we are both of Finnish origin but living in Sweden. Mother Teresa once said, "In 25 years among the people, I've come more and more to realize that it's being unwanted that is the worst disease any human can experience. The worst diseases today are not leprosy or tuberculosis, but rather the feeling of being abandoned and deserted by everyone." Anna Freud, closely observing small children in her wartime nurseries, came to a similar conclusion. The war acquires comparatively little significance for children, so long as it only threatens their lives, disturbs their material comfort, or cuts their food rations. It becomes enormously significant the moment it breaks up family life and uproots their first emotional attachments of the child with the family group. London children, therefore, were on the whole much less upset by bombing than by evacuation to the country as a protection against it. What I want to point at with these quotations is that for a small child, there is no more terrifying trauma than suddenly being separated from its primary attachment figure, in most cases the mother. The smaller the child, the more overwhelming the trauma, I would argue, and it leaves scars deep into adulthood. In Finland, approximately 70,000 children were evacuated to Sweden, and in some cases to Denmark and Norway as well, without their mothers, from the fall of 1939 to 1944. during the Winter War and the Continuation War. I was one of these children who was abruptly separated from my mother at the age of 4. For almost 50 years after the war, war children did not talk about their experiences, and Finnish authorities, politicians, doctors, parents generally thought that the evacuations had been a successful undertaking without any major adverse effects. And the first scientific reports of former war children, conducted mostly by questionnaires, underscored this view. And as one might expect, surveys only scratch the surface and do not access deeper underlying wordless traumas. A common thought has been that children are resilient and forget easily. This may seem true, as small children express their grief quite differently from grown-ups or older children. The child's expression of grief is short-lived. But to quote Anna Freud once more, it's a psychological error to conclude from this short duration that the reaction is only a superficial one and can be treated lightly. The child's life is still governed by the principle which demands that he should seek pleasure and avoid pain and discomfort. The little child will therefore, after a short while, turn away from the mother image in his mind, and though at first unwillingly, will accept the comfort which is offered. Is the trauma thereby forgotten? Nowadays, there is plenty of evidence that this is not the case. It will be repressed, lost to conscious memory, but will still affect the child, often way into adulthood.
The consequences of separation from caregivers and attachment figures at an early age might lead to what psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas related to as the untaught known. People's deep unconscious feelings and experiences that shape the person's perceptions and behaviors. It encompasses aspects of the psyche that are not readily accessible to conscious thought, but still significantly influence one's thoughts, emotions, and actions. Untaught known, when applied to children who have been early separated from their caregivers, suggests that they may carry within them the profound, unarticulated knowledge about the absence or loss of the primary attachment figure. Despite not being able to consciously express these feelings, the unarticulated can deeply impact the child's sense of security, trust, and emotional well-being. In essence, the untaught known implies that even though children may not consciously remember or understand the details of the separation from caregivers, the experience leaves an enduring mark on their psyche. This understanding underscores the importance of providing appropriate and early support and intervention to help children navigate the complex emotions and challenges associated with this early separation and loss. This connects to attachment theory pioneered by John Bowlby already during World War II. That the early relationship between infants and their caregiver shapes the individual's internal working models of relationships. The theory emphasizes that the importance of secure attachment, which forms when caregivers consistently meet the child's needs for comfort and security. In relation to the untaught known, the attachment theory suggests that even though the person may not consciously remember the early attachment experiences, these experiences deeply influence their unconscious beliefs, emotions, behaviors long into relationships and throughout life. The untaught known then encompasses the unconscious aspects of attachment that shape individuals' relational pattern and emotional responses. The disrupted attachment of the Finnish war children didn't involve just a few individuals. It affected 70,000 children, and even more if you consider the children that were sent to Denmark and Norway as well. Their attachment figures and families, as well as generations to come, if you consider the intergenerational trauma that will be passed on. This speaks to a collective and cultural wound alongside the individual one that has to be taken care of.
I flew to Sweden with my mother and my 2-month-old baby brother in March 1944. I was 4 years old at the time. Mother had assured me that we would all be staying together. But when we arrived at our final destination in Sweden, a Swedish couple had come to the station to take care of me. My mother and brother were to be billeted at another location in town. No one had warned my mother about this, therefore she had no time to prepare me for the separation. My own memory of this occasion is that I kicked and screamed and clung to my mother. But many years later, my Swedish foster mother told me that I did not protest or cry, just went with them quietly, my lower lip trembling a bit. I remained silent for some hours, but then started playing with the doll that they gave me. Some weeks later, when my mother came to take me to the photographer, I did not want to be with her and asked to be taken home to my foster parents. I stayed in Sweden for 1.5 years, returned to Finland for 8 months, and then spent another 1.5 year period with my foster parents in Sweden after the war, before finally going back to Finland for good at the age of 7. These repeated separations from my attachment figures in childhood broke the bonds both with my biological family and my foster parents, and left irrevocable scars which cast their shadow on my adult self. I unconsciously created a template of what life was like based on my childhood experiences. Playfulness, curiosity, fantasizing were missing features. Planning for the future was hard. I constantly anticipated catastrophes to occur, especially when traveling. Planning for, still to this day, I cannot remember any of these separations except for the first one, which I remembered a bit differently than my foster mother. And a great number of Finnish war children, as well as children from other countries, tell similar stories. Loss of memory, fear of showing emotions, being overly compliant and well-behaved. A retired teacher in England said, "When the long-term evacuees started to appear in my classes, I was often at loss. It was hard enough trying to understand their many accents. But the worst problem was trying to tell what they were really thinking. Most boys show their emotions, but many former evacuees had the ability to completely hide them." A common and dominant trait among war children has been lacking a feeling of one's own identity. The right to speak up, the right to occupy space, to claim something for oneself. Who am I? What do I want? I'm nobody's nothing, a little boy in Anna Freud's nurseries said. No one will hold on to me. There is no one who understands, no one I can trust. Personally, I was lucky to get great help in adulthood when I faced another separation, when my marriage was falling apart. I had physical problems and sought medical help for abdominal pain and sleeping disturbances. but eventually ended up in psychotherapy and later in psychoanalysis for 6 years. The continuity this offered and the trust I slowly could allow myself to feel in my analyst provided me with space where I could relive the unbearable emotions from childhood and begin slowly to think of and verbalize the unthinkable, that which was somewhere known but not yet thought. Later on, meeting with other Finnish war children in the Finnish war child societies provided me with a great sense of belonging. We immediately understood one another, more or less without words, despite our different social backgrounds and individual stories. And finally, writing down and publishing my personal story, The Silent Cry, was another scary but healing experience where I finally allowed myself to make my voice heard and show myself to the world.
Implementing trauma-informed practices, as described by Howard Bath in Australia, in healthcare, particularly in mental health care for migrant children and all children, is crucial to reach every child, every person, including those without obvious symptoms or obvious memories of a traumatic. It's the concept of just being aware of the scars that can be there. The concept of untaught known is especially relevant for children separated from caregivers in early life, as they may carry deep unexpressed emotion about this loss, impacting their sense of security and well-being, and leaving lasting marks on their mental and overall health. This highlights the importance of providing tailored support to help children cope with these untaught emotions. What I want to the uncertainty, the unarticulated wound is often recognized among others affected, such as in group meetings with other war children, as Mona described it. This important knowledge and understanding to carry forward within healthcare. We should form groups that patients can acknowledge and support each other in a collective sort of manner. The subjective first-person knowledge of early negative experiences and losses is of great importance in planning, assistance and support for all children, and especially migrant and refugee children today, in order to prevent the development of illness. It also provides better understanding for adults who have developed illness and disease as a result of early separation, losses and traumas. To enhance understanding of the patient's perspective of their life situations and ill health, and thereby improve healthcare and psychiatry especially, a reference group comprised of former migrant patients that collaborate with clinicians and researchers. This is the new field, take in the patients as well, to develop the care practices as is currently happening at CTP in Ballerup in Copenhagen. I'm so happy to hear that you include the user panel for developing the psychiatric clinic. But was the Finnish war children during the World War II an isolated phenomenon in history? We're far from it, unfortunately. It still occurs today. The separation of children from caregivers, well understood as harmful, is unfortunately utilized in global politics today as a form of psychological warfare. This tactic, exemplified by the US-Mexican border separation policy in 2018, aims to instill fear and control by forcibly separating families. Such actions, equivalent to torture and violation of human rights, inflict trauma on vulnerable populations for political ends, illustrating the insidious nature of this practice. The human rights organization has issued a response regarding the abduction of Ukrainian children, condemning its case of double abuse. They assert the evidence provided by Ukrainian authorities and confirmed by the UN Committee of the Rights of the Child indicates that the Ukrainian children have been forcibly deported from Ukraine to Russia. Well, not even mentioning what is going on in Gaza. Isn't it odd? We could, oh sorry, now this is your.
Isn't it odd? We can only see our outsides, but nearly everything happens on the inside.
Thank you.
Perfect timing. Again, we have time for our last speaker, Andreas Maercker, medical doctor from 2005, chair of psychopathology and clinical intervention at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. He also co-directs the department's outpatients clinic services. Professor Maercker has been a principal investigator in numerous national and international studies in traumatic stress research, former political prisoners from East Germany, Swiss child contract laborers and other groups. And he has authored and edited a large number of scientific and therapeutic books on the topic. Andreas will be talking about historical trauma, long-term distortions in international comparison. Please.
Hello to everybody. We are kind of having had a mixture and a lot of information, and I think some of you may already think about when will the lunch come, and the smells already come into our room. Thank you for being still here, being attentive if possible. I would like to thank the organizers and cultmind as a new institution for the idea to bring it all together and then create these kinds of mixtures, because I will talk about totally different things. Not totally, because of course you were talking about trauma, you were talking about things that are related to trauma, and resilience. I am very close to you in finding it very odd and problematic, but of course, it is on trauma as well. I'd like to tell you, this is a little bit an introduction on my personal background. Actually, I very rarely do this. You introduced me only as a medical doctor, but I'm more of a psychologist. I have the two educations, and therefore I don't want to be here as a medical doctor. I want to a little bit be a cultural something, psycho person. Psycho person, I know what this is still odd. So here, this is what I think are some good outcomes of research on trauma consequences we had over the last 30, 40 years. We heard about collective trauma, particularly in the last presentation. We know about potential intergenerational effects. Then we have the disorders. They were rarely mentioned at this conference so far, PTSD, but you know the invention of PTSD as a diagnosis was, I would say, socially helpful to many, many groups we are dealing with, even if the concept in itself may be controversial. Then we invented not too long ago, and it's not officially everywhere in the world, a new diagnosis, in addition, complex PTSD and prolonged grief disorder. And I would say this may open the space to other topics. And I'd like now, as an exception, to talk for 1 minute about things that will be presented by 3 postdocs from our division. They are here in the room, and they will later today and tomorrow in posters present on our research in these other areas, namely a kind of what is on there here, unified approach to transcultural psychopathology in a field of trauma consequences. You find here, without reading it, a lot of stars, and these stars are symptoms or symptomatic experiences or points of suffering. And it's possible to draw a line between the most prevalent and the most pressuring for individuals in a given culture symptoms, and we call this a galaxy model of psychopathology, and parts of our group is working on it, and I'd like to sell it to you. And then it comes that if we have in several cultures these kinds of star constellation models of trauma psychopathology, it then creates somehow related but leaves lots of spaces for unique or local experiences, galaxy altogether. But now I get back to what I want to tell you on historical trauma. And the term or the paradigm of historical trauma came to us, the cult mind community, by an American indigenous scholar from social work. You may know her name, Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. She introduced the concept in 1995. She herself always declared that she is from a particular tribe, and that the fate of her tribe was so important to her and to all her work she did in the field of she established herself on historical trauma. And I'd like to put this in forefront of what I'm going to tell. She brings together not only the trauma concept, but also the mourning concept, because of all the losses her culture, her tribe, and many others suffered. Now, I'd like to tell you that what I like to present from now on is actually a small resume of a book project. I'm a little bit old-fashioned. As a psychologist, I write books. I did it for 2.5 years right now, and I just finished my last chapter, and I will bring you some of it here in my presentation. It starts with a new kind of operationalization of the definition, because I added something, and but not too much to Braveheart's definition. And here are the 6 criteria. It has to do with collective trauma, and she says, and I agree to her, Braveheart, it's only historical trauma, this concept is valid when persistent racism, discrimination, or marginalization takes place. Meaning that other kinds of trauma, probably like yours from Finland to Sweden, where not discrimination took place for you, the Finnish children in Sweden and elsewhere, then it wouldn't be the concept wouldn't fit. And then there are other consequences: intergenerational trauma, if there is already other generations, and in the case of American indigenous, there are at least 7 generations. Then cultural, social disadvantages, social pathologies, in particular mistrust, and very important, and I think it brings something very particular to our discussion here in the cult mindset, no or dysfunctional collective victimhood narrative. And not all of the historical trauma constellations, or what one could regard as a historical trauma constellation fit this last criteria, but many do. I'd like to show you on this slide the 8 chapters of my book, the 8 historical trauma contexts, and I bring it together with my statement on researcher positionality. You find me here very close to the Stalinist and post-Stalinist repression point, because I'm from East Germany and I regarded the country where I'm from, East Germany, as a very repressive state, even if it was with a lower intensity repression than before in the Stalinist time. But you see here, of course, all the other areas or context I deal with in the book, and I told to at least 3 persons here in the room, my second last chapter is the partition of India, because it had so huge numbers and so few people know about the consequences of the partition of India. And you already read here the other things. I'd like to tell you that our group had preliminary work, and Celestin Mutu-Humana sits here and will present today, and he and me, we were putting together a systematic review on available assessment, since we want to have it clinically, practically relevant, and because these assessments were insufficient for several purposes. Some of them were only checklists, and you know, as a psychologist, you can't work with checklists. They are not scientifically very useful. We developed clinically relevant aspects of historical trauma, and I briefly show you what are the, and this was developed in the Rwandan genocide context, and these are the 5 sub-dimensions of the questionnaire. Please read through it, and you find here some things that may be specific to Rwanda, but we assume at least 3 or 4 may be pan-culturally valid as well. So, what did I do for 2.5 years besides teaching and doing other stuff on stellar models or stellar constellation model of psychopathology and other things? I was doing what I called myself, I coined this term, I guess, coupled scoping reviews. Because each of the chapter is a scoping review. And what is it? It's a preliminary assessment of the potential scope and range of available research literature. I read I would say probably 500 research papers of any kind. And I was trying to clarify working definitions and conceptual boundaries of the topic or of a subtopic of the field, and identify gaps in existing literature. I'd like to show you my very rough conceptualized matrix here, and it's very incomplete. I always were looking at the 8 chapters for concepts that are around, even with different names. I'll show you in a very busy slide later on the very different labels of it. In the experience generation and subsequent generations, if there are research on subsequent generations. And then I was looking for associated concepts or features, for example, the conspiracy of silence, a very, very important concept in regard of historical trauma, originally from Holocaust research, but of course persistent discrimination and marginalization. And the mindsets, prevalent psychosocial problems, societal changes, and I called the last part here remedies for interventions, empowerment programs. For good reasons, I don't call it psychotherapy because it's too Eurocentric, even if we had good discussions about this term in the morning. And a culture of remembrance, because I think even as psychologists, we have to participate I would say, in the new means and the new means and the movement of culture of remembrance. Very fast now, I'm rushing through examples of some of these concepts. And this is a study of my beloved Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. She did it with numbers and she did it quantitatively. And you find here the odds ratios if the risk in the indigenous communities she studied together with colleagues is higher or how much higher than in the general population. And the stars here, as you may know, signalize significance. And it reads 1.4 higher depressive disorders in indigenous communities of North America. Anxiety, similar. Substance abuse, substance dependence, similar. Personality disorders, only briefly mentioned, even higher, but it's problematic because when we Westerners call something personality disorders, it may be totally different in not only maybe, it is different in indigenous communities. And interestingly, at least in the US context, pathological gambling was not significantly different between the indigenous people. Actually, these were many thousands from a very large study. This is a secondary analysis. So, totally different methodology. I was interested in studies that showed survival messages or family transmissions. And often the question that was leading the research was, what overt or covert instruction guidance did you receive from your parents? In Georgia, in the Caucasus, where there is a very interesting and really great research, colleagues found out, for example, because of the Stalinist background, keep a low profile, chose a safe profession. In Russian immigrant women, do not step out of line, do not hope for anything, do not ask for help or indulgence. And here, then in a comparison studies between Ukraine and Israeli Holocaust families, because this kind of survival messages research, I don't know if you know it, but it is flourishing, I would say, and you can read it yourself. The thing is, this belongs to what is the intergenerational transmission. People get these messages into their families, and even us, I would say Ulrike here somewhere in the room, and me as Easterners, East Germans, we may have had some of these survival messages. Other topic, other example, other study, very interesting. This is a study from the economists. They showed that the vicinity or the closeness to a former gulag, and the gulags happily ended, happily is the wrong word, in 1960. In 2016, determined partly, times runs out, the mistrust level, and in 2016, up to 10 kilometers of the gulags, there were high mistrust, much higher mistrust than in the rest of the communities. Another study on remedies, for example, Israel sent its school students to Auschwitz, and that was these are results from a comparison studies between two groups. One went there, the other not, and the bold arrows show that these identification with victims was really increased by historical lessons in the people who, the students who joined Auschwitz, and to a lesser content, empathy, and a negative thing, hopelessness and fears. So I'd like to come to a busy slide, and this is my, no, it's not too busy, the second one will be even more busy, to compare here morning concepts of all these 8 historical trauma contexts. And you find here something that is more theoretical and others that are more empirical. And I would like, and then there is another kind of order here. But isn't it interesting that there are so many interesting and, let's say, inspirational concepts on grief and mourning in the context of cultural, of historical trauma around? This is really great work with what people did. And I come to the busy slide. Here I have some selected concepts of the various historical traumas together. For example, that American indigenous did research on identity features, the same with African Americans, or identity building in the case of Rwanda, and for example in Cambodian genocide research on time perspective. And my small lines here of bring together similar topics. For example, these identity topics to black psychology topics, and here to things like Ubuntu, the indigenous sociality that is described in several African communities, and it comes together to identity, very rare at least, but it's existent research on identity under political repression, like doublethink here, or conformity security, or confused identity as a mafia victim with social subordination. And you find other links here, and I will rush through it. The link here is from the remembrance imperative in the described in the Holocaust historical context to traditional knowledge. We should remember our traditional knowledge to different time perspective, because as we know, cultures differ in their time perspective. And my last slide are the lessons learned. I would say, without having given you an example, because I did not have time, this is here on treatment, we should look if the interventions for historical trauma consequences should be a substitute or an add-on for the usual trauma interventions. Because I think the trauma interventions or PTSD treatments we developed in the Western world are not sufficient to reach out to the needs of people that are affected of what I showed you. We need more group and community interventions, and there are brave programs to do it, and they should get much more audience. And we all should care for our open-mindedness towards indigenous intervention. Therefore, it was so particularly helpful to hear your intervention yesterday, and different to it, a little bit different, sometimes overlapping, empowerment programs. Thank you very much for your attention.
We started a little late, so maybe we can take 5 minutes extra time for questions. First question.
Hello. I have two questions. Thank you very much for the fantastic speech. I have a question to Pettit, and I have a question to Andreas. Maybe we start with Andreas. I will try to find proper words. Have you taken under consideration the aspect of landscape? What I'm thinking, when you have a first, second, third generation, and you are checking the processuality of trauma or PTSD or intergenerational trauma, have you thinking about making research with people, amongst people who are living in the place where the massacre happened? So then the consciousness of trauma is embodied are working with the concept of symbolic death, whereas in Poland we are working with concept of embodied death. Even we are talking about the same crime. Similar with Rwanda, what we recognize that very different approach dealing with trauma is when you are there and you are outside. And the question is when the PTSD is higher. Paradoxically, maybe not always when you are close. Maybe it's developing only when you are far away and you cannot confront with traumatic reality, with traumatic representation. So that's my first question. And I would ask you a question. Have you thinking about the risk of activism in humanitarian action? And have you taken under consideration that in professional humanitarian action, the concept of neutrality is also a kind of self-regulation procedures for people who are working in the field? Thank you.
Why not responding already? Yes, thank you for asking this question. Yes, I can say yes, of course. So many people whose community, whose society suffered from historical trauma live in diaspora. And this is actually the case. And sometimes scientific studies or studies of all kinds are only in the diaspora communities. And this is then it's actually it gives you the impression why not in the people with the people who live still in the areas, and this therefore is a big mixture. And I totally agree. Only one addition: the outcome that is interesting is not only PTSD and the number of PTSD. It's much more, and therefore I agree to what was said yesterday. PTSD is let's say only an approximate, and other things are even more important in the area of suffering after historical trauma.
Thanks for the question. Yes, I've thought a lot about that, and the activists that I interviewed did as well, and it was one of the key strands, sort of the key ethical dilemmas running through their narratives, especially when they talked about making the decision to go to Greece and really wondering, like, do I belong there? Do I really have something to contribute? Aren't there already professionals who are engaged and capable and competent there and ready? And one of the sort of key factors in making the decision to go was sort of consistently there was a very kind of slow humanitarian response in the Greek context due to sort of for a whole bunch of different regulatory reasons. And so there was this kind of delayed response, and a lot of activists, I think partly, a lot of the activists came from the EU and so felt sort of a particular responsibility like this. There was a kind of EU sort of identity activated there, that this is sort of, I feel, a greater responsibility to do something here. But then there were a lot of questions and doubts around, am I the right person? Do I really have, is this for me to do? Should I not send money? But the absence of a formal response, especially in those early weeks and months, was featured in their narratives as a kind of legitimating reason to go and to intervene. It served other functions as well. And over time, of course, the sort of official humanitarian response ratcheted up, and then there was a lot of sort of interlinking of the work between activists and humanitarian aid organizations, established organizations, that also produced a number of dilemmas for all actors on the ground. And I've been doing a lot of work since then with humanitarian actors, with doctors and nurses in Syria, for example, with doctors, nurses, and social workers in the earthquake-affected region in Turkey. And I think, these kinds of issues come up, they manifest in different kinds of ways, but I think there are some fundamental sort of overlaps. And I think neutrality as a professional imperative, I would say is impossible in many ways. I'd say that, but what I'd really say is that it always presents as a dilemma, that there is sort of and a painful one, that to enforce neutrality onto oneself is an incomplete sort of dilemmatic activity. Yeah.
I have a quick question to Kate as well. In your presentation, you shared that you also worked as a volunteer. So I wonder if not including some form of autoethnography was a conscious choice, or maybe just the time constraints did not allow that.
Yeah, in this case, time constraints. This was work that I ended up. So I went to Greece in 2015, answered a call from a very small burgeoning NGO, or it later became an NGO, continues as an NGO, to sort of coordinate medical activities in Moria camp on Lesbos. And then also, as part of that work, got asked to sort of offer psychosocial support for other activists and volunteers. And my questions about what on earth would that support look like? What needs are there? What is it we're doing here? What is it we think we're doing here? What are our wishes, desires, and what are the challenges and dilemmas? My questions around that, I started asking people, interviewing people. That work became part of my dissertation work for my PhD, and in that work, there's quite a lot. Some might argue an overload of self-reflexivity, and I mean, it's not autoethnographic per se, but there's quite a lot of grounded reflection there, but I didn't bring it in here so much, other than to note.
I think there's no such thing as an overload.
I've heard otherwise, but thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you very much to all of you. I want to ask Andreas a specific question. In looking at historical traumas, there's a lot of criticism or awareness of the danger of imposing the 21st century, conception of mental health to a past that it doesn't really represent how people at that time saw mental illness, right? Of imposing kind of a modern consciousness, right, on the past. Connected to that, in doing comparative analysis of different traumas, what do you think about the danger of oversimplifying context and particularities, right, of those different traumas that may not be necessarily comparable? So I wonder how you'd address those different critiques of that method.
The second critique I would take very serious, and of course I have to confess I'm still in the trap of not recognizing enough particularities and to maybe overgeneralize or something. For the first question, I would argue this is not a medical model. Historical trauma, the concept itself is so far from a medical model. It's on mentalities, and it tries to discuss some researchable, empirical evidence of changed mentalities and amount of suffering in a very broad sense. Therefore, I would say no historical trauma with Braveheart, me and others. This is nothing has to do with a medical model, and it could be an identification. And for example, our Australian colleagues chose it for their title. For, I would say, good reasons. It was in their title.
Thank you. I think we have time for a last question. Peter? No.
You decide.
Or maybe we can take two quick questions.
Oh no, okay. I'm afraid of Amila, so I'm gonna try to be very quick. But I wanted to thank you for your very, very beautiful talk. I was trying to figure out how to respond to it, but it's very emotional, and I think it hit something very, very deep. Maybe we'll talk together because it was very powerful. As a child of the Civil War, it hit in a place, and I identified with many things. But then turning to Mike, because it's also about kind of children, but then in this case, resilience. I was just very interested in how to think about resilience beyond the military. So the resilience historically in the US, but then how it's transported to Lebanon, where resilience becomes this genetic sort of cultural thing about the Lebanese resilience, but with the children of the civil war. So this is where you will find still this talk about trauma. So it's almost the reverse. And I'm talking about American psychiatrists kind of. And I was just wondering what you think about that. I also have a question for you, but I think Amila will kill me, so maybe.
No, not so much a question, more just a comment. I also wanted to say thank you to all of you for a fantastic panel. So many rich things in it, and I think so much to think about. The thought that came to my mind was that, okay, we have this really problematic resilience term, exactly as we've been talking about. But what strikes me in the way that we're talking about these subjects and the way that people are kind of responding and describing them is that we're dealing with this very long, slow, difficult coping processes. So not about resolution, not about finding a solution, but constantly over, many times over the course of a lifetime, trying to go back, to go over, because sometimes we have no choice, because sometimes our circumstances force us to, but just attempting to find a way to make that presence of the past, which is also remembered in the present, that matters also, is something that we need to just reconceptualize and think about differently and find different kinds of language for, I would say.
Okay, so in terms of psychology, resilience in the military, the attorney that OUP hired to vet my words would want me not to say very much, so I'm going to not say. We can talk about that, but no, I think that there's this. I can't say certain things. Okay, but yeah, I think it is the child and the soldier, and kind of this transference of kind of from child psychology to military psychology, and I think part of it is this notion of kind of developmental time, right, and kind of the vector of development, as I think that cuts across, these moments of vulnerability and critical periods. But definitely there was kind of this reverse engineering project, right? This is part of, and these are the stories we know, which I can't say too much about kind of how resilience also gets reverse engineered in a military context. So part of the people that Sigmund is selling his resilience program to is obviously military recruits.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Give them a hand, please.